All right. I think we'll get started. I can see still people trickling in. And I can see in the chat box people are saying where they're from, which is lovely. Bangladesh, wow. Australia, Japan. Love it. This is great. So I'm going to start because we don't have so much time, and I want to make the best use of our time. So it's really great to see everyone, and thank you all for joining for where I'm based very early in the morning, but I know for others it's late in the evening or in the afternoon. I'm really honored to be moderating this event today. I'm Katrin Geyer, and I work for the disarmament program Reaching Critical Will of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I'm really pleased to introduce to you today, in just a minute, a really wonderful set of speakers representing WILPF sections from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Japan, Germany, Italy, and Australia. Jessica, can you go to the next slide, please? Could everybody please mute themselves? That would be great. Thank you. So before we dive in, we'll just do the usual bit of housekeeping, and I especially want to share some guidance on how to use interpretation. Today, we have interpretation available in 4 languages, in English, Italian, German, and Japanese. And you can choose the language that you would like to listen to at the bottom right on your screen, where you have an interpretation icon. Can you go to the next slide, please? So you should see on the bottom bar of your screen 3 little dots. The world sign, interpretation sign. And there you can select your preference. And after you do that, it's important that you choose mute original audio so that you don't hear the other original language being spoken. If you're listening from your mobile phone, you should see 3 little dots on your screen, and you should be able to tap that and then also choose the language that you would like. And again, press mute original language so that you don't hear the other languages being spoken. So I hope that's clear for everybody, and you all could choose a language that you prefer to listen to. We also are streaming this webinar on Facebook, and we also are recording the webinar, and the webinar will be available on WILPF's YouTube channel in all 4 languages if we manage to get the tech working. Also, if you have any question, you can raise your virtual hand and we will call on you, or you can also just note down that you have a question in the chat. Although we also welcome if you take the floor and turn your video on and enter into direct conversation with our panelists. And there will be time for questions and discussions at the end. Okay, so let's turn to the interesting part of this webinar. So what is the purpose of this event? The idea for this webinar was really born from the fact that there is so much amazing ongoing work by WILPF sections that seek to expose the risks of increased militarization in their countries and abroad, and that are working hard to raise awareness about the devastating impacts this has on planet and the people, with distinct and disproportionate impacts on women and other marginalized communities. But they're also working to create and implement their vision of feminist peace. And many of the section representatives here today will be able to share insights from their recent research and activism about precisely these topics. And since I've seen people that aren't WILPF members yet, or that might not be as familiar with WILPF, I just wanted to say a few words about WILPF. So WILPF is the oldest women's peace organization in the world. And I'm sorry, I know for a lot of you that's already old news, but I thought we'd bring everything on the same page. And we actually turned 106 years old this year. WILPF was founded in 1915 during World War I, where women from all over the world came together in The Hague, the Netherlands, to discuss how they could demilitarize their countries to prevent a conflict such as World War I to happen in the future. And it had a really interesting root cause analysis of World War I and the problems, and they saw the problems lying in the military industry and the weaponization of their countries. And this analysis and work over the last century has really been instrumental to developing WILPF's work today as an intersectional feminist organization that works towards our vision of feminist peace, which is an understanding that sees security not as predicated on patriarchal norms of weapons and militarism, but on societal well-being and care, which also means to live life free from violence, persecution, environmental degradation, and economic exploitation. And so today we're in a place where we are a membership-based organization with sections and groups in over 50 countries. And just to cite one brief example of the long history of WILPF's work against military spending and weapons. The picture you see on the screen, or which is rather a compilation of pictures, is a really extraordinary advocacy event that took place in the 1930s. So at the start of the 1930s, WILPF collected an astonishing amount of 6 million signatures from around the globe that was collected for the World Disarmament Petition to present to governments to gather support for the disarmament conference held in Geneva in 1932. And these efforts were led, amongst others, by Jane Addams, who was the president of WILPF at the time and who also won the Nobel Peace Prize. So I just wanted to mention this example to show that we as WILPF today are really building on a long history of activism and work against violence and militarization. And the work of the sections presented today is continuing in that same spirit. Before I let my colleagues speak about their national context, I also thought it might be helpful to kind of contextualize what they will talk about in their national context within a more global context. So this event is taking place amidst a really devastating wave of militarized violence across the globe, from Colombia's ongoing brutal response to protests, to the devastating terrorist attack on a girls' school recently in Afghanistan, to the militarized repression against Palestinians, from the continued perpetuation of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and the continued police and gun violence in the United States, to name just a few of the really devastating recent developments. And these violent actions are possible because of the complicity of governments and corporations around the world, selling weapons worth billions of dollars and providing so-called military aid. And just a few weeks ago, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, has published its new report about annual global military spending in 2020. And it revealed that the staggering amount of almost $2 trillion was spent on weapons into 2020. And this is the highest level of military spending since 1988, which is the earliest year for which SIPRI has consistent estimates for global military spending. So the fact that military spending continues to rise and rise and rise is already extremely worrying in and of itself, and for many reasons, and our speakers will speak to many of the reasons why it's so problematic. But I think that the fact that governments prioritize to waste money on weapons while at the same time not being able to provide healthcare equipment and other resources to address the pandemic and its long-lasting social and economic repercussions is just really incomprehensible. And so there is really a concerning trend we're seeing across the globe. And this is something that all of the sections here today are challenging in their own ways and depending on their own national and local contexts. Next slide, please. So after this rather long and a bit gloomy introduction, I'm now very pleased to introduce our speakers today. So the format of this event is a bit different than usual events. We won't hear long presentations, but I'll ask our speakers concrete questions about specific topics, which also means that we have more speakers than usual. So I'm really happy to welcome Annalisa Milani from WILPF Italy, Chie Yoshida, Natsumi Uewara, and Yuka Kageyama from WILPF Japan, Anna Hauschild and Jennifer Menninger from WILPF Germany, Emma Tangi Takimbao from WILPF Aotearoa, and Ludmila Quidquo and Barbara O'Dwyer from WILPF Australia. I hope I didn't butcher your names there. I did my best. So let's start with like the first theme that I would like to talk about, and that is looking at the general trends of militarization and the impacts that this has. Emma, can we turn to you?
Right.
Hi, lovely to see you.
Thank you, and you too.
So you just co-authored a really important research report, which is called Towards a Feminist Budget. And I was wondering if you could, based on that report, start us off by explaining a bit how the situation is with respect to military spending and militarization in New Zealand.
Thank you, Katrin. And hello to colleagues and everyone listening in today. In general, there's been, as usual, the increased military spending in what is regarded or what is referred to by the current Labour government as the Wellbeing Budget of 2021. There's been a 5 billion allocation towards the military, and that's an average of more than 99.7 million every week. It's a 10.6% increase from 2020, which was 4.6 billion. So there's a general increase in the military budget. And also what is more worrying is the allocation in 2019 in June of 20 billion, which was to be spent over the next decade to increase the combat capability of the defense force. And this is to buy new Hercules airplanes, new frigates, military cargo ship, and other stock to replace the old stock. There's also plans to increase the army to bring the total number of infantrymen and women to 6,000 by 2035. So in general, there's been an increase and the trend is likely to continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. I think it's interesting to hear that, because at least when I think of New Zealand, I don't see it as a country that's heavily increasing its military expenditure and militarization in general. So what do you see are the implications of that in your context?
Yes, our concern is that, you know, being engaged in combat-ready operations of the military and increasing the military budget also will divert all these much-needed resources that are more urgently needed in the to meet the socio-economic needs of the people. There's been high levels of poverty, especially increasing child poverty, social lack of affordable housing, very flawed health system, and inadequate preparations for climate change. So in general, we see that you know, the increase of allocation towards the military will, of course, divert these resources away from the needs of human security needs.
Thank you, Emma. And I think what you just outlined here is, I think it's a really good analysis of why WILPF has been challenging militarization for so long, precisely because of this narrow concept of security and the fact that it is diverting resources from other much needed areas. And I briefly touched on this at the start, but I think the mismatch of priorities in military spending versus spending for human and planetary well-being has really come to the fore during the pandemic. But I think what's also interesting to see is how the pandemic has provoked militarized responses to a health crisis, right? And this is also something that you looked at. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to how this militarized response has played out in New Zealand.
Yes, thank you. The response to COVID-19 especially has been what we can refer to as the militarization of COVID-19. It's a health issue, but it's been the response has been militarized because they've brought in the defense force to manage the isolation centers, managed isolation quarantine places, and the response of the military. Of course, we know that the mindset of military is based on violence and armed force. So that same mindset is also being played out in the response to COVID-19. So we begin to see the use of military terms, and in terms such as, it's not a health issue, but it's a war that needs to be fought against, and it needs to be brought to control. On their website, it says, we are a force for New Zealand, and the operation is Operation Protect. The terms operation and control, these are terms that are used in the military sense, but it's been translated into this response to what is a global pandemic. More worrying is the use of the military as a social control in terms of government's response to COVID-19, because it implies that, in time they can use this as a control, as an excuse to control the population, and violating individual human rights and, of course, their privacy. So this is serious as long as the threat of COVID-19 situation continues.
Thanks so much, Emma. And I think we see this again, like in other countries as well. This the use of language, right? That the virus is an enemy that we have to fight, and it really paves way for this militarized response to that issue. So I think that was really interesting, and I think we'll talk a bit more about, what alternatives could be to this militarized response in New Zealand later on. But for now, I would like to turn to Jennifer from WILPF Germany. WILPF Germany actually also just published a really comprehensive report about Germany's disarmament and security policies from a feminist perspective. And so based on that report and the findings of that report, what would you say is the general state of military spending and militarization in Germany?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Hi, everyone. So according to SIPRI, the Swedish Peace Research Institute, Germany was the fourth biggest arms export nation between 2015 and 2019. This number shows that arms exports are an important factor for the German economy. Germany sells arms also to conflict-related countries such as Egypt and Mexico. There, these arms can facilitate human rights violations, including gender-based violence. Although Germany presents itself as a civil power worldwide, it has joined military interventions since the 1990s, for example, in Kosovo and Afghanistan. A new trend is that German soldiers are increasingly doing tasks that were traditionally done by development workers and humanitarians. For example, building wells in schools, in Afghanistan, or as it is the same case in Aotearoa, that they also help with the COVID pandemic measures. This diversification of tasks makes it easier to legitimize the deployment of the Bundeswehr, the German army, and makes it appear less harmful. Furthermore, Germany's budget for the Ministry of Defense is very high. In 2020, the federal government allocated 8.98% or 45 billion euros to the Ministry of Defense. This defense budget is thus higher than that of the Ministries of Health, Transport, and Education and Research. At the same time, the corona crisis showed that the health and education sectors in Germany are underfunded and that disadvantaged groups are more severely affected by crises. Funds are severely lacking when it comes to social justice, gender equality, or peace building.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for this overview. I think in the German context it's interesting, and I'm also German, that we always present ourselves as the good guys in the international community, while at the same time actually contributing to really severe human rights violations abroad, but also accelerating this, what you just described, militarized responses at home, when we still, also have work to do in other areas, and gender equality and social justice issues. So again, I think for me it's a surprising finding, similar with New Zealand, where you don't associate these countries with this type of developments. Let's move to with Australia. You just completed also a very extensive research report about the extent and the impacts of militarization in your country. And I was wondering if Ludmilla, if you could talk a little bit about what's been happening in Australia recently in terms of military expenditure, and what the implications are of that. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Katrin. Yes, we just completed a report which we subtitled Normalization and Mythology, to reinforce the picture of what's been happening in militarization in Australia. And there's been a period of major expansion, but it's been more than the COVID period. It's really been across the last decade. And in terms of defense total annual budget estimates, they've increased nominally by about 50% between 2010 and 2020, from around 30.5 billion to 45.5 billion. This is Australian dollars. And across this period, there's been two major defense policy kinds of statements. The first one came out in 2016. It was called the Defense White Paper. And then in 2020, last year, the Defense Strategic Update and Force Structure Plan have essentially created an acceleration of funds in the last 2 years or so, basically investing around 270 billion announced in 2020. So this latest plan means that defense investment is now proposed to be around 575 billion by 2030. This means that for us, the funding for defense has already surpassed 2% of GDP. What this has meant is that despite economic downturns during the COVID period and the need for funding things like health issues, education, providing support for the COVID response overall, there's been absolutely no cost cutting to the defense budget, despite these recent economic downturns. So this essentially puts defense and security ahead of all other areas in terms of Australia. And so there's very powerful echoes here, I think, with New Zealand, although on a different scale, but also with Germany.
Thank you, Ludmilla. And could you explain a little bit, why do you think that is? Why do you have this policy? Why is there this?
Yeah, there's some fairly clear reasons in terms of the overall agenda of the Australian government and its commitment to expanding this kind of role of shaping Australia's strategic environment. And it also goes alongside the growing securitization in the civilian space. And it focuses on this understanding that security is military, not human security. So it works against peace building and conflict prevention and works towards a military understanding of how to make for a safer, stronger Australia. The other important factor is also Australia's alliance relationship and its military interoperability with the United States in particular, and the geopolitical context and engagement, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, and particularly a growing posture and antagonism in its relationship with China. And this is woven through not just defence budget, but through foreign policy, through aid funding, international education, and then economic engagements across the Asia-Pacific region. But also, I want to point out that this is linked to a pattern of normalising and providing a safe, secure Australia and reinforcing this mythology and rhetoric around keeping Australia safe and secure and strong, which is historically grounded as well in the historical legacy of colonisation of Australia's Indigenous peoples, as well as the Anzac tradition that comes out of World War I. And then you layer on top of that expansion of export arms industry, which is marketed as a jobs creation strategy. So it's a very, how should I say, a policy that's interlaced into many different aspects, not just the defence budget, but it's all linked together.
Thank you so much, Ludmilla, for explaining this. And I think, again, we can see so many similarities in all of these different contexts, which is really concerning. And I think what you also mentioned in your report is that the public is actually supportive of increasing the defense budget. So I think that's also something really worrying, that it seems that the narrative about, you know, militarized security is needed is actually taking hold and is increasing. So that's really worrying. Barbara, I will turn to you now. You also mentioned in your report the concern about the increased militarized responses domestically, something that Emma already touched upon in the New Zealand context. Could you explain a little bit what the Australian Defence Force is actually being used for domestically?
Yes, I think we're actually very similar to New Zealand. The main use is, of course, is in domestic crises such as natural disasters such as bushfires and floods. But now in the COVID-19 health crisis, assisting with quarantining, as you know, Australia has huge problem with bushfires that have been increasing, and we had extremely serious bushfires in 2019-2020. And that was the largest ever peacetime mobilisation of the military, with over 80,000 military personnel, 8,000 military personnel deployed. And similarly, the COVID-19 assistance has already involved 2,200 military personnel. It's predicted that these figures will increase in the future, and certainly unless the coronavirus suddenly disappears, there's going to be increasing usage of military personnel there, and it's quite likely that we'll have increasing bushfires and floods as well with climate change. One of the things that New Zealand pointed out, and it's the same here, the terminology is very military sounding, because the bushfire ones are called Operation Bushfire Assist. The COVID one is called Operation COVID-19 Assist. They haven't used the term control so much, but certainly just using that terminology, it makes it a very overtly military exercise. And this is, you know, as Ludmilla has said, this is one of the things that really concerns us, that if people are just beginning to see the use of the military domestically as a normal thing to do without any objection to it.
Thanks very much, Barbara, for... Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Barbara. I wanted to mute you, which I'll do now. But yeah, thank you so much for that. And this is all a bit depressing as well. So I just want to assure you that we'll also be talking about what can be done about this. So it won't stay as gloomy as this. But we're not there yet. We'll continue talking about the negative impacts of this. And I'll now turn to WILPF Japan. And I think WILPF Japan wants to share a presentation. So Kozue, if you want to start sharing it now. And whilst you do that, I also wanted to congratulate WILPF Japan, because you are turning 100 years old this year. So just happy birthday. And I think with Japan, the context in Japan is really interesting, but also worrying because of the big role that US military bases continue to play in the increased militarization there. And I was wondering if Chie could talk a little bit to how the US military presence has contributed to that increased militarization.
Thank you. The U.S. military presence is a major contributing factor of militarism and militarization of Japan. The U.S.-Japan alliance practically started at the end of World War II when Japan was defeated. The unequal nature of the alliance is reflected in the state of force agreements so far, concluded under U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. SOFA stipulates the legal status of the U.S. troops stationed in Japan. Facilities and areas used by the U.S. military in Japan, their tax and immigration exemptions, host-nation financial support for jurisdiction, particularly the primary jurisdiction given to the U.S. military when a crime is committed on duty, shows the heavy inequality. Japan's financial support to the U.S. military also shows the influence of U.S. militarism. The Japanese government has paid much more than the host nation support required by SOFA, such as base worker salaries, base housing utilities, and so on. This special financial support, so-called sympathy budget, was introduced by the Japanese government in 1978. When U.S. government faced financial deficit and the Japanese yen became stronger. This year, the sympathy budget is $1.9 billion US dollars, about the same amount as previous year. The staggering amount of $7.3 billion US dollars is allocated to the various costs to host U.S. military. This amount exceeds by far other countries' host nation support, like Germany and South Korea. The defense budget of Japan itself has increased over the years. In 2021, the defense budget of Japan marked $51.7 billion US dollars, the largest ever. Purchasing expensive US-made aircraft such as Ospreys is one of the major reasons of the increase of Japan's defense budget, as well as Japan's military power.
Thank you so much, Gia, for explaining a bit more in detail the really close relationship between Japan and the US when it comes to the military and military bases and military spending, which yeah, is also quite concerning. And I was wondering if, well, how these US military bases have affected the people in the host communities around those bases. And Natsumi, could you maybe elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Under the US military hegemony, Japan itself has further colonized its marginalized communities by imposing the burden of hosting US military that includes Kyotanga's city of Kyoto Prefecture, where the Kyoto branches. But the heaviest burden has been put on the islands of Okinawa Prefecture, the southernmost area of the country, whose land area represents mere 0.6% of the national territory. Yet, over 70% of the US military bases in Japan is located. Okinawans have been suffering the multi-layers of colonialism and militarism of US in Japan. That is the history of Okinawa, where I am from.
Thank you, Natsumi. How would you describe this gap between Okinawa and Japan in the way that, you know, they are perceiving the existence of US military bases, but also the impacts? Sorry, I actually wanted, before we go to that question, I wanted to ask.
Maybe we can describe a bit more about
Yes.
what's happening exactly in Okinawa.
Exactly.
So, so the US military has been stationed in Okinawa since 1945. From 1945 until 1972, Okinawa was placed under the direct US military occupation, whereas the rest of Japan regained independence in 1952. The US military facilities currently occupy about 18% of main island of Okinawa. There are many negative impacts of US military presence. Among these negative impacts are noise pollution by military aircraft training and operations, wildfires caused by live fire drills, aircraft crashes and other accidents, and crimes committed by US soldiers, including sexual assaults. So Okinawan lives were not respected. Noise pollution around major bases such as Kadena Air Base or Futenma Air Station that are located in densely populated area have caused serious health problems of residents. Yet the agreements of no-fly zones and times are often violated. Live fire drills on bases have caused wildfires that destruct environment severely. There have been cases of stray munition in the residential areas. Accidents such as aircraft crashes and dropping aircraft parts on residential areas have occurred too often. People are fearful of these accidents that could be fatal. And there have been numerous cases of crimes such as murders, armed robberies, arson, and sexual assaults. Between 1972 and 2020, there were 6,052 cases of arrest, but the official statistics reflect only a tip of a much larger iceberg. Additionally, it is now known that the secret agreement was made in 1953 between the two governments to avoid indictment when the US military personnel are arrested. Victims of sexual crimes are even more silenced with deep pain. As Okinawan feminist peace activists have analyzed, sexual violence by US soldiers is an intrinsic part of the organization of the military that incorporates sexism and racism. So we concur with the analysis and believe that the presence of the US military is a hindrance to the achievement of human rights of women. Many times, Okinawan people have democratically expressed their refusal to militarization, yet the two governments have been imposing the military buildup under the disguise of alleviation of the burden of Okinawan people, as seen in the massive military base construction plan in Henoko. The budget for this plan keeps increasing even under the pandemic, when people's lives and medical service should be assured.
Thank you so much, Yuka, for this. And sorry, I was jumping over you because that was really important to get a bit more information about how this, really plays out in detail in Okinawa, and just to learn a bit more about the gendered implications of US military presence. And now I was wondering, because Okinawa is a unique case, right? How does it differ from Japan mainland?
The gap is a result of systematic discrimination against Okinawans by mainland Japanese. It is also a problem of the US-led national security of Japan that is supported by militarism, sexism, and racism. The non-violent protests by Okinawans have been ignored by the Japanese government. And to the majority of people, Japanese people, Okinawa is only the popular resort destination. The mainland Japanese people see the problem of US military presence as a problem of Okinawans, not their own. The sexual violence issue is not very covered by the media, let alone the systematic analysis of the military and sexual violence. The gap shows the fundamental problem of militarized national security of Japan and the lack of democracy in Japan. The militarized national security has made the lives of people, particularly of women and children in Okinawa and other host communities, insecure, violating their basic human rights. We are determined to work towards changing the mainland Japanese people's attitudes and achieving genuine security for all people. Thank you.
Thank you, Natsumi, and thanks also for this hopeful note at the end that you'll continue your struggle for justice and recognition. So that concluded the first part of the webinar, where we talked, where we just wanted to get a general impression of how militarization is playing out in the different contexts and what the impacts are. I'll just pause for a tiny few moments to give our interpreters a little break. So the second theme that I would like to look into a bit more is the role of specific weapons and weapons production. And I'd like to start with WILPF Australia and the Australian government's role in the production and manufacture of weapons. Barbara, based on this wider trend of militarization in Australia, does the Australian government also have a policy to expand the current manufacture and export of armaments?
Yes, sadly it does, and has a very has one which is actually quite shocking to many of us in Australia, not just WILPF members, but to a large number of the population are shocked when they hear this. In 2018, the government announced a defence export strategy, setting a 10-year plan to expand Australia's defence industry to become one of the top 10 global defence exporters. This is something that I think most people are quite perturbed about, the fact that Australia would like to be building its reputation as an armaments manufacturer and exporter. Ludmilla did actually refer to it earlier on, that part of this, or largely their justification for this, that it will create jobs. Much of the defence industry in Australia is actually centred around major foreign defence foreign defence providers operating through Australian subsidiaries. I mean, there's the big armaments manufacturers like Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Thales. They're all here in Australia, but they're operating a lot of the time. They're operating through Australian subsidiaries. The domestic defence industry, of course, under this policy, is growing. And the military supply chain currently comprises over 3,000 Australian businesses and indirectly supports 15,000 additional businesses across Australia. So this is an extremely big business by any imagination, and not something that most people support, even if it does create jobs.
Yeah, and I think this argument about creating jobs is something that actually WILPF Italy has tackled and exposed, but we'll get to that later. So that would be interesting to learn how they were going about this. But I also was wondering, because it seems that in the Australian public, there is a growing acceptance of this narrative that the military security is what is desirable. And I was therefore wondering if major armaments manufacturers have a role to play in that by, for example, funding non-military activities in Australia. Ludmila, could you maybe speak a little bit to that?
Yes, thanks, Katrin. Yeah, I think it's really interesting and quite insidious to see how much the expansion of what's referred to as Australia's manufacturing industry is also being paralleled to the military industry complex developing. And it applies not just in that context, but it applies to funding to a number of, I'll just give you a couple of examples. One is this independent research institute called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is sort of seen as a independent think tank in terms of commentary on military and defence issues in particular. Its funding comes from the Australian Defence Department and industry players, and it clearly represents a kind of an example of the military's expansion to Australian social mainstream kind of discourse and commentary. But its funding also comes from Lockheed Martin, Thales, Naval Group Australia, Rafael, Raytheon, and many others in the military industry. So while it markets its independence and its openness, one also, and it's definitely a go-to organisation in terms of think tank analysis, one really has to take it quite seriously as to what the implications of this are. Another example is the support of different education institutions that are strategically aligned with defence industry, such as various universities and some of their marine engineering programs, some of their naval shipbuilding programs, the business schools of a number of universities, and even my own university, Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. I'm based here in Canberra in Australia. And I'll just finish quickly and make a comment about our lovely War Memorial, which is in Australia, which is also funded by not only several other major military and arms manufacturers as well. So there's a full-on integration, very, very quickly taking place in terms of acceptance and normalisation in Australia in terms of armaments and defence. Thanks.
Thanks, Ludmila. And I think that is a really important piece of information, because it shows us how the military-industrial complex is really investing a lot of resources to maintain that narrative and discourse about why we need weapons for security, and is quite successful at doing that as well. I would like to turn now to a specific type of weapon, which really is the most destructive and worst of them all, and which also wastes huge numbers of money for its research, production, and modernization, and that's nuclear weapons. And I was wondering if you, Anna from WILPF Germany, could speak a bit about Germany's views vis-a-vis nuclear weapons, because I think that even though it doesn't own nuclear weapons itself, it still contributes to the continued existence of nuclear weapons, and by extension, the continued waste of resources and continued threat of mass extinction. So how would you describe Germany's role in achieving a world free of nuclear weapons?
Yes, thank you for having me. Before I talk about Germany in particular, I think I would like to talk about why speaking up for nuclear disarmament is actually a feminist issue in itself. And that's building up on the long work of WILPF and reaching critical will, of course, in this field. So I think the first thing is the problematic view that nuclear weapons are seen or supposed to be a strategic weapon, that are just a deterrent, and not seeing them for what they actually are, weapons of mass destruction. So that's the first step. And nuclear weapons as a patriarchal tool to reinforce the idea that strength and power and fearing and threatening a constructed enemy is supposed to keep a state or an alliance secure. So this in itself is very contradictory, because you are threatening, so you are actually building up on insecurity for an alleged security. And this is the first thing that's very problematic, and that can't be our understanding of security, because real security cannot be built on the threatening of use of weapons of mass destruction on one another. And now looking at Germany, although Germany does not own nuclear weapons itself, it doesn't have a German nuclear weapons program, is not a nuclear weapons state, it is hosting US nuclear weapons on its territory, and it is contributing to reinforcing and holding up to the supposed logic of security through nuclear deterrence. So I think countries like Germany, or also the Netherlands and other NATO countries who don't have nuclear weapons themselves but are hosting nuclear weapons, can have a very crucial and important role if they want to. So if they would acknowledge and support that nuclear weapons are in fact in any way not legitimate, then that would very much put pressure on nuclear weapon states, maybe in a different way than if a non-aligned, non-nuclear weapon state would. So the German government actually continuously refers in its policy that they are committed, to a world free of nuclear weapons, while at the same time, they are holding on to the idea of nuclear deterrence. They still have nuclear weapons on our territory, and they are also investing and supporting the investment of nuclear weapons infrastructure when it comes to modernization of the US nuclear weapons program. So, because I would like to be on a more positive note, if there would be a shift in policy to commit to real nuclear disarmament by the German government, that would mean banning nuclear weapons from its own territory, not investing financially into nuclear weapons infrastructure of other countries, in our case, the US, participating in bilateral and multilateral dialogue and action, and taking a clear stance on the illegitimacy of nuclear weapons in general, in Germany, but also around the world, and supporting and ratifying, of course, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thanks also for kind of taking a step back and explaining why nuclear weapons or nuclear disarmament is a feminist issue. I think that's good for us to kind of contextualize this discussion within a feminist discourse as well. And you already touched a bit on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which also is referred to as TPNW, or Nuclear Ban Treaty, which became international law in January this year. And it is the first international treaty that makes the research, development, possession, and use of nuclear weapons illegal. And so how does Germany position itself towards this treaty, knowing now everything that you said about it, not having nuclear weapons itself, but stationing, having US nuclear weapons based on its territory? Like, what does it say about the treaty?
Yeah, so the German government right now has not ratified or supported the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It has also not participated in the negotiation. So there is definitely a very, very far distance of the German government towards the TPNW. But I would say that especially since the entry into force of the TPNW earlier this year, like you mentioned, that as the political debate in Germany joining the TPNW has started to be more active and visible again. And that's, of course, also driven by civil society actors, partner organizations from ICANN in Germany. And I would say the problem in the German discourse until now is that one of the main arguments by political actors opposing the TPNW in Germany has been that the TPNW is allegedly contradictory or undermining other nuclear disarmament efforts, like, for example, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which Germany takes a strong stance on. But this argumentation has actually been proven false by many experts. And interestingly enough, in January, including by experts by the academic service of the German parliament, the Bundestag. So I think that was also an important factor in the German debate, that it's actually very much supportive of a whole nuclear weapons disarmament structures building up on many different angles. So if Germany would support and hopefully ratify the TPNW, that would mean from a German stance that we shift the perspective away from this talk about nuclear deterrence towards supporting the ban of nuclear weapons because of its catastrophic humanitarian impacts that they will cause and that they have caused already until now. And it would mean listening to the experience of survivors and people who have been disproportionately affected and impacted by the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons testing. And of course, that means especially survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and indigenous people around the world. So the TPNW is also taking into account the disproportionate impact on women and girls of these weapons, which is a huge milestone within nuclear disarmament efforts. So all of that, this change in perspective would be a feminist approach on nuclear disarmament, and Germany should support that. And to be a little hopeful, although I think there are many steps ahead and it's not a change overnight, but there will be federal elections this year in Germany. And there is a possibility that there might be a shift in government being led by the Green Party. So numerous politicians from different parties, including some of the Green Party, have openly declared their support of wanting Germany to join the TPNW. So if there's a change in governmental responsibility, there's hope that there might be also a change in discourse and policy, hopefully, concerning a more bold stance on real nuclear disarmament. And although I do think that it wouldn't happen overnight and all of a sudden, because also maybe politicians who are supportive of the TPNW are still kind of bound within other restrictions, alliances, and the overall dominant discourse until now. I do think it would be a step away from just talking about nuclear deterrence towards talking about the humanitarian approach in opposing nuclear weapons altogether and everywhere.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks also for this more hopeful outlook, which I hope will come to fruition sooner than later. Let's move to the last part of this discussion, which is looking at alternatives. So we talked a lot about, we heard a lot about how this increased militarization in all of these different countries and contexts is manifesting, and yeah, it can get quite depressing to be confronted with these really daunting numbers and developments. But there are alternatives, and there are ways to counter this trend. And this is what I would like to discuss now with my colleagues. So what are the alternatives to all of this, and what can each of us do to support alternatives to militarization? And I would like to turn again to Emma from WILPF Aotearoa, who led this really brilliant research arguing why New Zealand does not need a military budget and a military. And so why do you argue that New Zealand doesn't need the military, Emma? Please unmute yourself. You're still muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. First of all, New Zealand enjoys friendly relationships with its neighbors. So it's under no direct threat, and it's not a threat to the neighbors. Although there are the geopolitical scenario may, there may be warnings in the coming future, but at the moment there's no danger of no direct threat to New Zealand's territorial sovereignty. And even if a threat exists, the size of the armed force is too small to deter any aggressor. Also, given New Zealand's role as a peaceful country, in its role in the nuclear-free as a nuclear-free country, and among the first to sign the treaties, nuclear-free zone treaties. And so a transition from a combat-ready armed force to a civilian agency to meet the needs of New Zealand and its Pacific neighbors, there is potential for that. It's not cost effective to maintain a military force. So given all those reasons, and especially the fact that New Zealand is a peaceful country, I think there is a lot of potential to, there's a lot of potential to do away with its military. Having said that, or is that your next question? Sorry about that.
Yes, exactly. So what would you say then? What is the alternative to the military? And
yes,
also,
so we've been questioned on what would happen to the livelihood of those who depend on the military. So what we're saying as an alternative is that there are civilian agencies that could that are better suited to take over the role of the armed force in natural and humanitarian disasters, maritime search and rescue missions, fisheries and resource protection, and border control. it would be much better off if funding was diverted to these civilian agencies to conduct, to carry out these roles, this non-core role of the armed force. And so if we do that, we are going to free up the resources that are being chewed and absorbed by the military, and would be in a better position to target the needs of the people, the vulnerable people who are in need, and to be able to meet the other needs. I think there is potential to be like Costa Rica, that doesn't have a defense force. Having said that, I acknowledge that there are, I think in the audience, Edwina from Peace Movement Aotearoa, and also Megan, who are also would be in a better position to also share alternatives. But,
thank you, Emma. I was wondering, you did mention how these freed up resources could be used, but why does it have to be a feminist budget? You know, like why can't we just say we cut the military and then we give some money to other areas? Why does it, what would a feminist budget do specifically?
Yes, it's a tool that is being aimed at being inclusive, that takes care and responds to the needs of vulnerable people from all diversities in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, age, and income, different status, and disability, language, etc. It is also aimed at being compassionate, because it by responding to the needs of the most marginalized sectors of the society. It's also based on mutual respect, so that people everywhere, including women and children, can have equal access to the relevant services and everyone can contribute to their full potential. It rejects violence in all its forms and inequalities in all its forms. So that is what a feminist budget is all about. It takes into account also the paid and unpaid labor, and especially recognizing that women are the first casualties in a crisis, and they do carry out much of the care and domestic work and much of the unpaid labor. And in fact, a lot of this, when we look at peacekeeping, and which is why we don't really need, why we can do without a military, is because the military actually depends on the role of women. Because, you know, women have to manage their households while they allow the men to go out into a war and peacekeeping. So the women have to take over all these roles. So, in fact, the peacekeeping and international peacekeeping and the war have depended on women's unpaid role, because it is the women who have to take over all these roles while the men go out to war and doing peacekeeping. So that is why we believe that, you know, we can do without a military. And yeah.
Thank you, Emma. I think that was a very convincing plea for abolishing the military. And because I think sometimes we criticize a lot, but we don't come up with alternatives. And you really are laying out, you know, how it could be done otherwise. So I really appreciate that. I will jump one question that I was going to ask you, Emma, just because I think we're running out of time. So I will move straight to Barbara to share some views, what she thinks could be alternatives to the current militarized development in Australia.
Look, there's a very obvious alternative. and that's a properly coordinated and resourced civilian capacity, which would include already existing but expanded emergency services. We already have a range of emergency services in Australia. We have the Rural Fire Service, we have state emergency services, there's emergency health services, there's Red Cross, there's NGOs, there's but of course none of them are properly resourced, either financially or in terms of equipment. What we it's very easy to just call in the military to help with natural disasters. If you have a big flood, you have all these fit young men and women that they bring in to just fill bags with sand to prevent floods. The military don't actually do fighting of fires in bushfires because they're not trained to do that. But we don't have enough civilian capacity to do it. So it's really a matter of thinking past and things like, it costs a lot more to run a military helicopter, for instance, than it does to run a civilian helicopter. We just have to get past this, what seems like the obvious thing to do, to call in the military, because we need lots of people to do things. But if we had properly resourced and coordinated civilian services, we could easily, well, not easily, it's never going to be easy, but we could very readily deal with natural disasters and such things as the health crisis that we have now with COVID. Because it's not, it really isn't nice to see soldiers literally almost on guard in hotels where people are being quarantined. It's not something that is an image that we really want to be projecting. So really, there's a simple answer. It's just needs to be properly lobbied for and advocated for, and the government convinced that this can be done without it costing a great. If you just took some of the money from the military, that you could then have the civilian capacities properly resourced. So it's really quite straightforward.
Thank you,
Well,
Barbara.
it should be straightforward.
It should be straightforward. All that's missing is the political will to do it. Thank you. Jennifer, what would you say, what can be done? What can also, I guess the question also comes to mind when we listen to all of this, what can we as individuals do to address this issue, both within Germany but also worldwide? What would you say to that?
Well, I think the answer to this question is very complex, and it also depends on the capacities and abilities of each individual person. But I think the first and most obvious thing I would say is that politics in our countries needs to become more feminist and just. For that, we need to elect and support parties and politicians that make such policies, if they exist, of course. There are many international disarmament agreements that call on states to disarm, and anyone who has the time and resources can work to get their state to join and implement these agreements. Therefore, you can join civil society groups and organizations such as WILPF that advocate for disarmament and peace. If you don't have the time to be an active member, you can also donate money to these groups and organizations. And there are also petitions that you can sign. You can join demonstrations or send letters to your local politicians demanding change. And I think this webinar clearly shows that all of our struggles are linked and that we need solidarity across borders. We need to join forces with other social movements that are working against racism, poverty, and climate change, for example. I think together we can achieve more, and our goals are very similar. A success that Anna has shared with us is the nuclear ban treaty, which WILPF has worked very hard for. Here it is very clear that the production testing and use of these weapons particularly affect non-Western people and destroy the nature for a very long time. So I think we really need to work together and take these chances that we have to change the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. That were some really concrete action points that we can all do. So thank you so much for that. And I'm reading the chat as well as statements of support as well, which is nice to see. So I would now like to turn to Annalisa from WILPF Italy. WILPF Italy has been co-leading a really amazing initiative, which is really direct action, so to speak, to address and prevent Italy's continued arms production and selling of arms. Because some might actually not know that Italy is the 10th largest arms exporter in the world. So Annalisa, you're in the train, so I hope the connection will keep stable. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit what's been happening in Italy in terms of its arms exports, and then what the efforts are to prevent this.
Thank you very much. What WILPF Italy is really engaged for 2017 is the increasing selling arms with Saudi Arabia and Emirates, because the bomb of that are coming in going to Saudi Arabia and Emirates is coming from the factory RWM that is in Sardinia, and that is working with rim metal from Germany. They are working together. So the main in Italy between 2015 and 2019, the government authorized 1.5 billion in arm export to Saudi Arabia, so a large number. In the first 2-year period between 2019 and 2020, trade exchange between Italy and Saudi Arabia recorded an increasing of 6%, and to United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and is the second largest market of arm export. Some investigation in 2018, a group of between all NGO, between all also WILPF, start an investigation with the ONG from Yemen, because of course the bomb that is going to Saudi Arabia is going to Yemen, is going to the war in Yemen, and with the NGO from Yemen, they start against the Italian government an investigation. The Italian government parliament in 2019 stopped for 18 months the selling the bomb from RWM factory in Sardinia. So it was in this period that born the idea from a group of NGO, Sardegna Pulita, Women, Donne Ambiente Sardegna, WILPF Italy, born the idea to change the factory, because the factory of WM was closed for the moment. And 300 families went against this because they were the worker of the factory. These 300 families went against the close of the factory. So with some parliamentarian from the government that say, no, it's not possible to close this factory. Also, the trade union and they say that it was not possible to close the factory, and also the worker, local administration, they want to open the factory. What is interesting is that the WILPF Italy was confronted with the trade union worker, CGL CISL, and the trade unions say that they would like to have an implementation of a sustainable military production in a framework of national defense. What means this sustainable production of arms? We don't know what means this. Really, it's incredible, this position of a trade union worker. Also, if we understand that the problem is the job of 300 families in this factory. But we, with a group of the NGO that are particularly from Sardinia, Donne Ambiente Sardinia, and the Constitutional Human Rights Group, we, with the WILPF Italy, we propose a project. Sardinia is one of about in Sardinia about 3.5 million sheep, about 5,000 goats. So Sardinia is one of the biggest production of cheese factory. The problem is that this cheese factory is only one type of cheese factory, cheese, Pecorino Romano, that is going in the international market. With through the international market, the price of the milk is very, very low. And the sheep are not earning any money from this market. So we propose to transform with innovative project this RWM factory in the cheese factory, and with using also the recovery fund money coming to Italy in this moment. But this proposal not receive any answer from the government. The industrial people, the industrial people from Sardinia, also at the national level, Confindustria, they say no. There is no any possibility. The only possibility is to restart with the bomb factory.
Thank you, Annalisa. I think although you ended on a note that, you know, where you just explained that there is still resistance to this proposal, I think it does show that there are alternatives, and it also goes against this argument that we need to have arms companies for the jobs. And it's not that you just came up with, you know, just a random new factory. You really identified a gap in the market, and it could be really something great for the population there. So I really hope that you'll be able to continue that struggle, and that it will be heard at some point. So thank you so much for that, Annalisa. And we are now a bit behind schedule, but the last section of this webinar is really a Q&A session, and we won't have much time. So I'd ask you to think of questions you have, and in the meantime, I'll just kind of summarize a bit what we've heard. And I also wanted to share some resources from other organizations, because WILPF isn't working in a vacuum on this. And I think it's nice to also know that there's a lot of other people working against military spending. So if you have a question, just put it in the chat, or just note that you have a question, and then we can call on you and you can ask the question directly. But try to be as concise as possible, and also please indicate if you have a specific person in mind that you would like to ask the question to. So what we can see from the discussion so far is that militarization is happening across the world, and it is due to a number of root causes. And although there are local nuances and specificities, as we have heard, we see there is a common overarching trend of spending more on weapons, of militarized responses to domestic issues, etc. And because of the devastating impact of this trend, it needs to be broken and it needs to be reversed. And it was great to see and learn from all of you what, you know, how you see this could be done and what you are actually already doing to change this. And so while WILPF has exposed this mismatch of spending for many decades, the extreme discrepancy of priorities really has come under heightened scrutiny by many other disarmament and human rights organizations, activists, and the public since the pandemic hit. And we really have seen a reinvigorated wave of calls to stop this addiction to weapons and to divest these billions of dollars instead into the protection of human rights and the regeneration of our planet. And I really appreciated to hear from all of you today how this could be done. And I did want to mention just a couple of other amazing initiatives that are going on, because WILPF's work isn't happening in a vacuum. And I want to encourage all of you to also check out these initiatives if you feel like you want to do something about what you've learned today and building on what others have said already. So there is, for example, the month-long Global Days of Action on Military Spending, which actually just concluded last week. You can go back with the slide to just the Q&A section. And really, a lot of amazing events happened, and new resources were coming out as part of this campaign. And also more than, or close to 150 organizations have signed an appeal to reduce military spending and to defend people and the planet. I also want to note there's a transnational institute that just launched its new report, State of Power 2021, which has really powerful visuals and graphics on all the money that's spent on violent institutions, including the military. And they do a really great job in highlighting in a visual way how just a fraction of money spent on weapons could solve different global crises. And so, for example, one example that they give is that eliminating global poverty and hunger would require only about 13% of annual military spending. So I think it's important to kind of compare these numbers to know how absurd the military expenditure really is. And just I know that we couldn't you know, have all of our sections speak here today that work on military spending, but I also wanted to just briefly give a shout out to WILPF US. They just recently launched its Call for Peace campaign, and that also includes lots of resources about how the bloated US military budget could be spent elsewhere to benefit human need. So because we're running out of time, I won't be able to mention all the initiatives. If you're interested, you can contact me to learn more, but I just wanted to really emphasize that there are thousands of people that are working for a better and more just world without weapons. And I hope that, you know, knowing that it's something that we can use as a source of hope and energy to continue working for feminist peace. So I don't see any questions in the chat, which is fine, but if there are, okay, Honey is asking a question. Women, I'm just going to read her question. Can I ask about the raising of collective voices of women in militarism and extreme weapons of destruction? Women have a rising voice in the climate crisis in defense of our children and future generations of all life. Is there a chance of joining voices as women in defense of the future of children and life? Honey, I don't know if you have, if that question is directed to somebody in particular, or if not, if just any of you from the panel wants to speak to that. I think it's just about, you know, mobilizing as women to address the different crises. Or Honey, if you want to jump in and explain a bit more.
Okay, I don't know who to ask really. It's just as a parent and grandma and auntie and all that stuff, you know. I just feel that our little wee voices are just seen as tweety magpies, you know. We just squeak in the corner, and the issues are so great and so urgent you know, when our ancestors threw spears and stuff, nobody anticipated nuclear weapons. The power of male firepower now it's gone beyond exponential, it's total. And my question really has to do with the potential for joining of issues where women are passionately and existentially concerned with the future. At the moment, looking around the world, I can see absolutely no interest on behalf of the predominantly male managers of the world economy and world militarism. They're not the slightest bit interested in the little tweeting noises we make. It seems to me that the climate crisis is a realm in which women can move forward, outward, and yell out, because we're mums and grandmas, and this is our kids, and this is the species of our continents. And it's a question, really, a general question, which perhaps is for a later discussion, but whether there is latitude for joining voices of women across the world, and absolutely life-threatening cultures that we live within now, male-dominated cultures. And quite honestly, I don't think they're going to act in time for our kids with regard to climate, and I don't think they're going to in the slightest bit act on matters of militarism and threat and conflagration. So it's a general question, we can't really answer it now, but I'd love to talk more about it. This is an exciting group. I've never been here before. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you, Honey. And I think it's an absolute legitimate question. And I think Jenny mentioned this in this space, but also in other spaces before. I think if I just take the liberty to say what you said before, is that we really need to join. I think actually we need to join beyond with other social justice movements, and not only the women's movement or the feminist movement, but really looking at, Fridays for Future and this really young generation that's so strong on the climate crisis. And then we have Black Lives Matter and like the racial justice movement. So I think what we need to do, we need to stop also working in silos and joining all of these forces, because at the end of the day, we have very similar objectives. And at the end of the day, everything is interrelated anyways. So I agree, it's a conversation to have on another day, because it's so big, but it's also so important. So I thank you for the question. I'm just checking, because we're running out of time. Barbara asked about the reconversion idea, so reconverting arms companies into other companies. She was wondering if there's much talk about this idea in other countries, so converting military budgets to other types of industries to ensure good jobs for workforces losing military jobs. And I think that's an important question, because this is one of the arguments that we always hear when we talk about, getting rid of the arms industry or reducing military spending. So do you see, and I guess it's not directed to anyone in particular, but do you see, whoever wants to take the floor, that there is talk in your countries in general about this?
Maybe, Katrin, I want to answer to Barbara shortly. So, of course, there is not so much talking about the reconversation in Italy. We are really a minority that are struggling with other NGO in Italy in this moment. Also, as I said before, the trade union workers are opposing to the reconversation of, in this case, RWM factory. Because they say this, they want to have sustainable arms. So we don't know what means with these sustainable arms. Also, they are accusing us to be utopic. So I think that we need really a strong, hard change in the mind of the civil society, fighting for change the mind of civil society. That's very important for us.
Thank you, Annalisa. I'm really sorry. I think we have to come to an end because our interpreters have only agreed to be with us for 1.5 hours, and they must be really tired at this point. So I just really briefly want to share some ways to get in touch with the different sections that have spoken here today. So you see the website addresses, the social media handles. If you want to get in touch, please reach out. If you aren't a member yet, and if you're based in one of these countries, again, reach out to the different sections. You can also become an international member if you're not based in any of these countries. You can also look if there's a section in your country on the WILPF website, and then become a member or become an international member. And I encourage you also to subscribe to our newsletters to stay up to date and continue our struggle for a world of feminist peace. And the last slide, can you go to the next slide? It's just really to show some of the resources that our sections have published. I encourage you to maybe take a screenshot so you have it in case you want some further reading. A lot of these were already shared in the chat as well with the direct links. But yeah, these are just some resources by WILPF on this topic. So I think, having said that, I want to thank all of the wonderful speakers. I also want to thank the interpreters for staying longer, and all of you for your great questions and comments. I'm sorry I couldn't address all of the comments that came through in the chat, but I did notice them, and I hope others did too. So thank you so much for your active participation, and I hope we can meet soon and continue our struggle together. And with that, I'll close the meeting. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, Katrin.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.